Chapter 1. The Orchard Wedding. Marleycombe, a quiet English village where time dawdled, woke gently that June morning. Lilac hedges lined cobbled lanes. The post office doubled as a grocer, and most villagers could recite your grandmother's maiden name. A hush of excitement, like the scent of blooming roses, drifted through the air. The church bells rang at 9, not for Sunday service, but for a wedding, the union of Alina Taylor, daughter of retired Colonel Geoffrey Taylor, to Matthew Waring, a charming outsider who'd arrived last autumn, setting hearts aflutter. It was an event to spark gossip among the older ladies and envy among the young. The ceremony was set in the orchard behind the vicarage, under a white linen arch framed by apple trees in full leaf. White chairs stood in neat rows beneath dappled sunlight, the air rich with freshly cut grass and early roses. Miss Jane Marple arrived at 10, her cane more habit than necessity, her silver hair pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat with a navy ribbon. A pale gray coat, freshly brushed, wore a single violet on the lapel. She nodded politely to villagers Mrs. Olcott from the bakery, Mr. Green from the parish council, young Mavis Finch, once a runaway to London, now homesick and heartbroken. Such a lovely day for it, Mrs. Olcott said as they entered the orchard. You'd think the weather knew it was special? Indeed, Miss Marple replied softly. Too much sunshine before noon often means afternoon trouble. Guests settled, their chatter low and expectant. Reverend Allerton, new since Reverend Hensley's passing, stood beneath the arched spectacles, askew, prayer book trembling in his hands, unaccustomed to the weight of such an occasion. Colonel Taylor, stiff in his old military uniform, mustache bristling, checked his pocket watch twice in 5 minutes. At 10:45, Lena arrived, stepping from a pale blue Morris Minor in a cream satin gown with lace sleeves. Cases hurt, her golden hair swept into a soft bun. Her bouquet of white lilies and blue forget-me-nots trembled slightly in her hands, though her smile held steady. She's brave, Mrs. Olcott whispered, losing her mother so young, planning this wedding alone. Yes, Miss Marple murmured, and marrying a man we hardly know. At 11 o'clock, the guests turned to the path where the groom should have appeared. He didn't. At first, it was dismissed to men, after all, had odd ways, a delayed shave, a lost cufflink, perhaps a longer route from his cottage. By 11:10, whispers stirred. By 11:20, Peter Hodge, the best man and local schoolteacher, rushed into the vicarage, hair damp with sweat. He emerged pale, breathless, and approached the colonel. Their hushed exchange turned heads. The vicar tried to speak, but no one listened. The orchard's festivity dissolved into confusion. Gone, the colonel boomed. What the devil do you mean, gone? Peter's voice cracked. He's not at the cottage. He's not anywhere. Elena stood motionless under the arch, her face pale, not with hysteria, but with a quiet, controlled resolve. She blinked slowly, gazing across the orchard as if expecting something to emerge from the trees. As Miss Marple rose, moving toward the vicarage as the crowd buzzed with panic and speculation. Her eyes caught something odd on the orchard path, where gravel met grass, a dark, irregular smudge, like ash, though no pipe had been lit nearby. Had been lit near it. She knelt slowly, of course, and touched it with her gloved finger still warm. Someone had been here recently. She stood and looked toward the common beyond the vicarage wall. The path curved, slightly disappearing into the trees. No one else seemed to be paying attention, and yet the boots, a faint print, heavy, tread, pointed toe, the sort Amen might wear, but not quite at ease in the countryside that night. The news spread faster than smoke. Matthew Waring had vanished on his wedding day by morning. he would be found not in his cottage, nor in the woods, but in the old brick kiln by the Morley boundary. What was left of him was Berlaruca Nizo. The body had been burned almost completely. The only thing left untouched was a small gold ring in his jacket pocket, the wedding band he never got Tower. Miss Marple was not shocked, saddened. Yes, but not surprised, because people in Marley always had secrets, and murder-like love never came without warning signs. Chapter 2. Smoke. Among the apple trees, the next morning, Marley awoke not to the sweet promise of a summer wedding, but to the shadow of tragedy mist still curled around the hedgerows, and the centauve honeysuckle lingered in the air, but the warmth of celebration had thawed, vanished like breath on a mirror by half-6 word had spread. Matthew Waring had been found, or at least what was left of him. It was Edwin Toller, the groundskeeper at Marlecombe, who discovered the body. He had gone to inspect the old brick kiln on the edge of the northern boundary, a duty he performed once a week, more out of habit than necessity. The kiln hadn't been used since before the war, its red brick mouth now choked with ivy and rusted wire, but that morning the kiln had still been warm. Inside, among the scorched to bristly charred remnants of clothing and the blackened outline of a man, the face was gone, so were the hands, but in the pocket of what had once been a coat, a gold ring had survived. The fine damage curiously untouched, as if it had chosen to bear witness. By the time the police arrived, the village had gathered in small, buzzing clusters. Most people kept their voices low, but their eyes darted. It was thickened of scandal Marley hadn't seen in years, not since the poisonings at the almshouse in '39, or the mysterious drowning of Mr. Hartley's second wife. People remembered those incidents the way one remembers a particularly bitter winter. Not fondly, but vividly. Miss Marple sat in her cottage parlor, a small pot of tea steaming beside her and a half-eaten scone on her plate. She was not the sort of woman who rushed out for drama. That was Merce Finch's domain, and Mrs. Finch had already gone down to the police cordon, twice armed with curiosity and a folding umbrella. Instead, Miss Marple listened. Radio was off, the windows were open, and through them came snippets of gossiping. The passing voices on the lane burned completely. They said only Thebans left Fancy doing such a thing the night before his wedding. Cowardice. More like couldn't face marriage or guilt. Perhaps, you never know what people air hiding. Miss Marple stirred her tea. She had never been fond of conjecture. It was like dressing a wound before looking at it properly. Still, she had her own suspicions. She always had. By midday, Inspector Lennox arrived from the county, a man of serious bearing in sound boots. He wore a mustache, bristled as the colonel's, and had the kind of manner that silenced rooms without trying. Miss Marple had met him before, during the affair of the missing antique snuff boxes in Lower Brixley. Unthought. Him intelligent, though occasionally too confident in logic and not enough intuition. Went first to the colonel's house. Ilanina was staying there, of course, pale, quiet, and sitting by the drawing-room window, like a portrait come to life, had not wept, not once when Lennox questioned her. She answered with calm precision, though her voice occasionally faltered on the softer syllables. Didn't seem afraid. She said, when asked about Matthew's mood, he was perhaps a little distant. This past week, not cold exactly, but distracted. He thought it was nerves about the wedding or something else. She murmured almost too faintly to be heard. Miss Marple arrived just as Lennox was leaving. "Oh," said the inspector, not displeased. Miss Marple, "I might have guessed you'd already have a theory." "Not at all, Inspector," she said mildly. "I never theorize until I have facts, but I do listen." He chuckled. "That you do," sighed. Miss Marple sat with Elanina She said nothing for several New Testament time. Silence was the kindest start. Finally, Elelina broke it. He wouldn't have left me, you know. He may have been distant, but he wouldn't have run. Miss Marple nodded. I believe you. Elelina turned to look at her fully. Do you? Because no one else seems today look at me like I'm either a jilted fool or a very lucky woman. I see neither, said Miss Marple gently. See a young woman who has just lost someone dear under dreadful and suspicious circumstances. There was a long pause. He never told me much about his life before Marley Combe. Elelina said quietly, bits and pieces his work in London, his move here for peace and quiet. But nothing real, nothing personal. Thanks. Very interesting, Miss Marple said, not as a prompt, but a conclusion. The rest of the day passed in a fog of questions and speculation. Lennox interviewed nearly half the village, trying to trace Matthew's last known movements. Peter Hodge swore he had seen him at the cottage around 9 the night before, smoking near the gate, like he was thinking too hard, but no one had seen him after that. The constable found a footprint in the orchard path, the same one Miss Marple had seen in ash by the hedge. But nothing conclusive, no weapon, no fingerprints. By sunset, the official verdict was suspicious death by fire. Possibly self-inflicted, though nothing could yet be proved unofficially. Marley Combe had its sound verdict. Someone had murdered the groom and done so purposefully. Miss Marple sat by her window that night, the sky darkening to assoff blue. In her lap was a letter. Elelina had given her one. She'd found in Matthew's dresser drawer, sealed, addressed, only to be opened if I disappear. Miss Marple had not yet opened it. She had been waiting for the right moment, because in villages like Marley Combe, truth never came loudly. It came instead like smoke through the apple trees, slowly curling, hinting at the fire beneath. Chapter 3. The letter and the lie. The following morning began with a gray stillness that seemed to hold its breath. A mist hung low over the fields of Malcolm, turning hedgerows into ghosts and rose bushes into smudges of colored. Church bell struck 7, slow and echoing, as though unsure whether to ring it all. Miss Marple sat at her kitchen table, with an envelope in her hand, the letter from Matthew. Wearing, she had not opened it the night before. Some things she believed ought to be faced in the clean light of morning, not at twilight, when emotions are prone to exaggeration and memory begins to play tricks. Now, with a fresh cup of tea beside Harriet, the silence of the village beyond the lace-curtained window, she carefully slid the envelope open with a letter opener shaped like a swan's beak. A gift from her nephew Raymond years ago. Inside was a single page, handwritten in blue ink. To whomever finds this letter, if you don't, I am missing, or worse, then something has gone very wrong. I have reason to believe that someone from my past has found me. I left London for Arison, and that reason is not finished with me. Don't assume it was an accident. Assume it was my choice. Tell Elelina I loved her truly. I only wish I could have told her everything. Mouth wearing. Miss Marple read it 3 times. The letter was brief, but every word was loaded with weight. She had seen letters like this before. Not often, but enough to know that it was not the work of a man staging a dramatic exit. This was fear, not flourish, the fear of some man who knew he was being hunted. She placed the letter in an envelope of her own and tucked it into a drawer beside her Bible. She would tell Inspector Lennox about it, of course, but first she wanted to follow the thread quietly, as she always did. Here on way, at 10 that morning, she made her way to Matthew Waring's cottage. It sat on the edge of the common, shaded by hawthorn trees and half hidden behind a crooked gate. It was a modest place, neat, beautiful, as though someone had only ever lived in it. Halfway, curtains were drawn, and the garden had grown wild in places, as though Matthew had stopped caring to tend it. She wasn't alone. Lennox and his constable, young Archie Bell, were already there. You're early, Miss Marple, Lennox said. Not surprised. I find one often sees more before the rest of the world is awake. Lennox gave a dry smile. You're not wrong. See? Interior thicketage was sparsely furnished, a dark wood table, one armchair, books on war history and architecture, an old gramophone in the corner. On the mantel, a single framed photograph, Elalina, standing beside the church gates, her hand raised mid-wave. Miss Marple examined the bookshelves, a strange mix of man who read The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, alongside detective novels and gardening guides, was either deeply bored or trying to build a new version of himself in the bedroom. A second photograph, this one older, tucked in a drawer, a man and woman smiling sitting in the background. The man looked like Matthew, but younger, darker. The woman, striking sharpie, wore a red coat. On the back, faded ink, Penny Emma Brighton, 2018. Miss Marple handed it to Lennox's girlfriend. He asked aloud. Perhaps she said, or wife. There's no record of marriage. Okay, he noted. We're checking financials and employment records, but there's a gap. He vanished from London 2 years ago, stopped using his real name or anything digital, and now he's been found. Miss Marple said quietly, by someone who perhaps knew exactly where to look outside. Mrs. Finch stood by the gate, pretending to pick at her sleeve. Morning, Miss Marple. It's called to brightly terrible business. Isn't it just terrible dead? You know, they say he wasn't even from Chelsea. Said he was but old postmistress. Swears no Waring ever lived at the address he gave. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed just slightly. Thank you, Mrs. Finch. As always, your memory is sharper than any filing cabinet to lie about. Matthew's address, Wasmell, almost too small, but liars always start with the small things. Bench at her cottage. Miss Marple pulled out her old scrapbook, clippings, old notes, village records she'd kept over the years. She didn't trust a memory alone. Facts mattered, and somewhere she felt something about Matthew's story would appear crooked when laid against the rest of the picture. By late afternoon, new piece arrived. Inspector Lennox called on her, a grim look on his face. We've had word from London. Matthew Waring wasn't his real name. He was born. Michael Warren changed it by deed poll after a trial in which he testified against a former business partner man named Douglas Kent. Financial fraud. Kent went to prison out on an early release. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Revenge, she said. Looks like it. Kent disappeared 3 weeks ago. His parolee officer says he went quiet. Could be anywhere. Could be here, but if so, Miss Marple murmured, why wait until the wedding day? The inspector shook his head. That's the part that doesn't add up. But it did too, Miss Marple, because weddings were more than ceremonies. They were endings and beginnings, and sometimes, for those who could not bear to be forgotten, they were perfect opportunities for closure, even if it meant murder. Chapter 4. Tea with the Colonel. By the third day after the wedding that never was, Marley Combe had passed this stage of shock and slipped into quiet, relentless speculation. The bunting had been taken down, the flowers wilted in their buckets, the orchard chairs had been folded and stored away as though nothing unusual had occurred. But in every parlor, in every whispered exchange at the bakery or the butcher's, the question lingered like smoke. Who killed Matthew Waring or Michael Warren? Asti now knew him, and why? Miss Marple believed in patterns, not the kind found in cross-stitch samplers, but the ones buried in human behavior. How lies begging where truths twisted, how people acted when they thought no one was watching. And she had noticed one pattern in particular since the news had broken. Colonel Taylor had not spoken, not once, not to the newspapers, not even at Delco pub. It was not natural. The Colonel was many things: proud, bristling, fond of tradition and stories of service, but he was never silent. Specially, not in the face of scandal that touched his own terso. That morning, Miss Marple brought a small basket, a blackberry scone and a jar of homemade jam to the tourist cottage, her walking cane tapping gently against the jagged flagstones as she climbed the short path. The colonel himself opened the door. Miss Marple. He blinked. "You shouldn't have troubled yourself. It's not trouble," she said, stepping past him gently. "I thought you and Ilalana could use this something sweet today." He led her to the sitting room where sunlight filtered through chintz curtains, and a wood fire crackled faintly despite the warm weather. A silver tea service sat untouched on the sideboard. "Elenina was not there. She's in her room," the colonel said gruffly, pouring tea with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly. "Hasn't eaten much, hasn't spoken much," said there. "You must be worried." He stared into his cup. "I sent her to Phoenician shore in Kent, made sure she had a proper education, a good name, and now," hessed up his jaw tight, "she almost married a man who wasn't even who he claimed." Told Miss Marple sipped her tea in silent zillowing. It's the way that to settle. She had learned over time that people spoke more freely after they had heard themselves fall silent. "I didn't like him," the colonel muttered, at last, wearing or worn whatever his real name was, to smooth. "Cool. Well, Menard," always smiling, but with nothing behind it. "I told Ellen so'ned." What did she say that he made her feel understood? He gave a bitter smile. "What can a father say to that, miss?" Marple nodded. "She told me once," she said carefully, "that he never spoke about his life before coming to Marleycombe, hadn't." The colonel said it was unimportant now. What sort of man brushes away his whole past like crumbs off a table? A man running from it, perhaps. There was a long pause. "I never knew what he wanted with Elenina," the colonel said, voice quieter now. "She's a fine girl, but no great inheritance. It's just me and this house and memories of things that mattered more 30 years ago than they do now, miss." Marple looked directly at him. "Colonel Taylor, may I ask you something rather blunt?" He nodded, stiffly dead. "You ever, even for a moment, consider that your daughter might be involved in Matthew's death?" His cup paused mid-air. A muscle worked, and he shicked. "No," he said, after a long moment. "She may have been deceived, but she's not a killer. I'd staked my name on it." Miss Marple gave a slow nod. She believed him. Not because he was certain certainty she had found was often the mask off bland love, but because she had seen Elenina's face. The loss there was to raw still something about the colony story. Didn't sit right, not quite. Was Matthew or Michael ever crescent pliant? Did he argue with Elenina? No, never. That was the odd part too. Polite to patient, I always thought. Well, he trailed off, yes. I thought he was waiting for what, I don't know. The colonel said slowly, but sometimes when I caught him looking out the window, or when he came back late from one of his walks, he looked prepared like a man expecting something bad, miss. Marple's expression did not change, but her mind stirred. They had all assumed this was about revenge. A man from Matthew's past finding him and settling a score. But what if it wasn't just about the past catching up? What if Matthew had known it would? What if he had come to Marleycombe not to escape something, but to prepare for it? As she took her leave, Miss Marple stopped in the hallway, glancing at a photograph on the wall, a black and white portrait of Elenina as a girl no more than 10, smiling beside a handsome woman in a dark skirt suit. "Your late wife?" she asked gently. "Yes, it." The colonel, with a rare softness. "Margaret died in 1939. She looks familiar," Miss Marple murmured. "Was she from around here?" "No, Manchester. Originally came south for work. She was a nurse during the war." Miss Marple gave a small smile. "So many of our stories began in war down there." Outside, the air was thick with the smell of cut grass. She paused near the garden wall, her eyes narrowing their barely visible line. The ivy was a second gate. Old rusted it, led not to the lane, but throwed the trees towards the common, and beyond, that the brick kiln would be easy to come and go unnoticed, especially if one had done it before. Chapter 5. The Man with the Scar. The next clue came not from the listener from Nina, but from a stranger. It was early evening when the man arrived at the village pub. The fogs and lantern, a narrow, timber-framed building with low ceilings, uneven floors, and the distinct smell of old ale and damp stone at locals were gathered as usual in murmured knots, spinning their pints and feeding off the scandal in careful doses. Malcolm never feasted openly on tragedy. It sipped it politely, like a tea. The man entered alone. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a navy coat far too heavy for the weather. His face, beneath a travel-worn cap, bore a fade scar across his left cheek, thin curved, like the mark left by shattered glass or an old blade. His eyes were dark and watchful. He didn't speak for several minutes, just ordered a whiskey neat and took a seat by the window. Mrs. Finch, who had been halfway through a story about Matthew wearing suspiciously perfect teeth, stopped at mid-sentence. So did several others. Miss Marple heard about the man before she saw him, by the time she reached the pub an hour later, having left Elalinas with a fresh pot of broth and a quiet word of comfort. The stranger had drawn in Nuglances to become a figure of mystery, and Marley always made its way back to Miss Marple. Like moths to a lantern, she entered quietly, took her usual seat near the hearth, and ordered tea. The man was still there, his glass empty, his eyes never far from the pub's wooden door. It was Mr. Giles, the landlord's will, finally broke the silence. Not from around here, are you? The man smiled slow and cool. No, just passing through, heading north. Are you South family? And the wreathed smile returned tighter. This time, not anymore. Miss Marple's eyes never left him. Not his boots clean, but worn North Ethic leather satchel he kept tucked beside his feet. She noted too that he hadn't removed his coat, despite the stuffy air inside, and when he stood to pay, his movements were careful, controlled. Outside, the evening was drawing, and swallows darted low over the rooftops. The bells of St. Mildred's tolled 7 times. She rose as he passed. "Excuse me," she said gently, "but I believe you dropped something." He turned. There was nothing in her hand. He stared at her, not rudely, but cautiously. "Did I know?" she said pleasantly, but wanted a closer look. "Forgive me, an old woman's trick." The day startled him. He gave a low laugh, almost admiring. "And did you see what you needed to?" "I think so." "Who are you, Miss Marple?" The name passed between them like a challenge. He nodded slowly. "Well, Miss Marple, you may call me Mr. Dunning." "And what brings Mr. Dunning to Marley?" He looked her in the eye. "Closure." He walked out without an idle word. The next morning, she brought his name to Inspector Lennox, who had already begun assembling a list of men who might have a connection to Michael Warren's. Matthew Warren's. "Past Dunning," Lennox said, flipping through a folder. "Douglas, Kent's old associate. That's the name." John Dunning, former accountant, small-time minister, disappeared from London after the trial. He looked up, and he's in the village now. Calls it passing through. Miss Marple said softly, "But men like him don't just pass through quiet places like Marley Combe. Not unless they're following something or someone." Lennox exhaled. "You really think this is revenge?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. "No," she said at last. "You'd think it was personal, but not only revenge, something more." She handed him the photo she had found earlier in Matthew's cottage. "Pignoned M. Brighton, 2018. "That woman," she said. "She's not in any local records, but I believe she's part of this puzzle." Lennox frowned. "You think she's connected to the man we knew as Matthew?" "I think she may be." The reason had changed his name later that day. A letter arrived at Miss Marple's door, plain envelope, no return address. Inside was a note typed on an old Machines stay out of it, Miss Marple. Isn't one of your village puzzles? It's bigger than you. Think I folded it calmly and placed it beside her fireplace, bigger than she thought. No chef thought it was exactly as big as murder. Usually is one broken life rippling out or ruin others, and that's when it happened. The second body was found. Chapter 6. A second silence. The body was found at dawn. Just as the village was beginning to rouse itself, it was the milkman, Arthur Piercewell, stumbled across it. He had taken his usual shortcut across the lower meadow through the copse behind the Marley schoolhouse. When he saw a dark shape at the base of an old oak, at first he thought it was a blanket or a bundle of discarded cloth, until he saw the shoe, one leather brogue, polished and fine. The man was lying face up, eyes closed, coat open his throat, had beans lit. No sign of struggle, no footprints nearby, except the milkman's own just blood, pooled into the moss and clover like spilled ink. The man was John Dunning. By 7 o'clock, the constables had cordoned off the grove, and Inspector Lennox was already grim-faced, barking orders to a team that looked even more bewildered than they had 2 days ago. The first murder could be attributed to Tovan Jeans. It had motive history, a neat criminal thread that tied it back to London, but this, a second body, mere days later. And of the suspected dimmer, it did not fit, unless, as Marple thought it fit too well. She arrived at the scene just after 8, having heard the news from her neighbor, Staffy, who had seen the constables rushing past on her morning walk, and deviantly turned back to spread the word. Lennox did not stop her when she appeared. He had long since learned that resistance only delayed the inevitable. Well, she asked, quietly glancing toward the shaded grove. No weapon, no signs of a fight. Neatly done, Lennox said, keeping his voice low, knife across, throat killed instantly, pockets untouched. No money missing. This wasn't a robbery. No, Miss Marple said, it was an execution. Lennox frowned. Any thoughts? Ennui. Someone would want him silenced. She met his eyes, because he knew who killed Matthew Waring, or because he was about to say. Lennox folded his arms. You think came here to confront Matthew, and someone else got to him first, or Shazade. He came to make peace, to warn him, and was killed by someone who wanted no peace at all. There was a long silence. Birds sang above them as if nothing unnatural had occurred, but the air smelled of copper and damp soilness. Marple turned to the constable. Did anyone see him last night, Constable Bell? Nodded. He was seen leaving the Fox and Lantern just after 9, walked toward Common Alone. Yes, ma'am, miss. Marple's mind stirred something about that detail. The direction he walked didn't sit right. The grove, where he was found, was in the opposite direction from the village inn. Why would he walk all the way around through the meadows, through unlit fields alone, unless he was meeting someone, unless he was called? Tears called. They're back at her cottage. Miss Marple sat down with a blank notepad, one Overman's old college notebooks, and drew to columns Mitchell Warren, a.k.a. Matthew Waring. Fled London 2 years ago. Changed the main gauge to Elalina. Seemed nervous in last week's left letter, implying danger. Murdered body, burned in old kill. John Dunning, former associate of Douglas. King trapped in village 3 days after Matthew's death. Claimed to be Sakin closure, found dead near school. Grove, murdered, throat slit. Nothing stolen. At the bottom, off the page, she wrote 3 words in large letters. Who benefits most? The question she found was often the only one worth asking. Not who hated the victim, not who had reason to act in anger, but who stood to gain once danger faded and the dust settled. Who stood to live better, richer, freer, safer, because those men were dead. She thought about Kalanina, Palliant, still like a candle that had gone out. She thought about the colonel with his tightly held grief and his silence, and she thought about the woman in the photograph, Penny. Whoever she was, she wasted a missing piece. Miss Marple was certain of it. To look in her eyes, weary, alert, told her someone who knew too much even back then. No one had yet spoken her name. Perhaps, Miss Marple mused, no one knew it, but someone must have. She took the photo back to the cottage and set it beside the newspaper clippings. Lennox had brought her old headlines from 2018, The Trial of Douglas. Kent-born, one dated April 3rd, caught hair attention Exartner, testifies in a multi-million fraud case, key witness claims, fear of retaliation. The article didn't name Michael Warren, directly just referred to him as the anonymous whistleblower, but in the final paragraph there was a sentence that sparked a chill in her spine. The witness, who was protected under an alias, arrived at court accompanied by an unnamed family companion, described as in her late 20s with auburn hair and a red coat. Miss Marple looked again at the photo, pinning the red coat. She wasn't just part of Matthew's past, she had witnessed the fall of Douglas Kent. She had been there for it all. So, where was she now? And more importantly, was she still alive? Chapter 7. The Girl in the Red. Coach P. Midday, Marleycombe, was no longer a quiet village gripped by rumor. It had come reluctantly a place under suspicion. 2 men dead within 3 days, O'Nefton, burned beyond recognition. The other killed with precision. The police had expanded the search perimeter, and plain officers were now walking the streets of the villagers welcomed it. Others muttered darkly about disruption and lined the tactics miss. Marple ignored both camps. She had seen this before, how violence had hard, still water and stirred the soup people would begin behaving differently now. Careful ones would grow quieter, the impulsive ones louder, and when the wrong, someone would say too much. But Miss Marple wasn't listening only to what was said. She was watching what people did when they thought no one was paying attention, and she was looking for Penny, the photograph Penny and M. Brighton. 2018 had told her more than the article. The woman's coat was a bright cherry red, and even in the faded print, it stood out like a wound. Miss Marple had seen that coat before she remembered. It had been worn not in London or Brighton, but here in Marleycombe, not recently, months ago. It had been winter, she recalled, sitting by the bakery window, enjoying a weak cup of tinned a custard tart, when a tall woman passed by the glass, her hair tucked into a beret, red coat buttoned to the chin. Not a local, she would have remembered a face like that. The woman had disappeared up toward the old post road, the one they drawn behind the vicarage, and out toward the woods Miss Marple had assumed she was. Aguas at Marley Hall, or one of the quiet artists who rented cottages in Summerand, tried to find themselves in watercolor. But what if she wasn't passing? Through what if she had never really left by the time Miss Marple reached the vicarage? That afternoon, the Reverend Allerton was out in his garden, pruning acidly neglected hedge of boxwood. Miss Marple. He greeted her, a little breathless. "I trust you're well, though I suppose that's a silly thing to ask just now." "I've been worse," she said, gently stepping around a fallen trowel. "I wonder if I might ask you something about your lodger." He blinked. "Lagador? Yes, I believe you mentioned a few weeks ago, that you were renting the upstairs flat to a young woman, quiet, you said, off and away." "Oh, Miss Layton, yes, she came in late winter, said she needed time away from city life, paid in advance, hardly makes a sound. Does she still reside here?" "I believe so, comes and goes at odd hours. I think she's a writer, always carrying books, has she?" Eva Warner, red coat. The Reverend's brow furrowed. "Yes, now you mention it. She has striking color, like something from a film, miss." Marple smiled. "Would you mind introducing me?" The vicar hesitated. "Well, I don't believe she's in just now. Butchar, welcome. To wait in the parlor, if you like." She declined politely. She didn't need a conversation on. Yet, she needed to see the room, miss. Marple returned at dusk, walking up Vicarage Path, slowly, eyes scanning the windows. Above, a light was on in Thoiper. Left window, the room she suspected was Miss Layton's. She wasn't interested in confrontation. She was interested in confirmation. And it came, just as she washed her knee to leave the upstairs curtain. Shifted a brief second, a face appeared, pale, sharp. Featured older than the photograph, unmistakably the same woman. Her eyes, quick alert, locked with Miss Marple's formerly a heartbeat before the curtain fell again. But that was a new beneath. Q was alive, living under the name Miss Layton and hiding. In plain sight, back at her cottage, Miss Marple poured herself a brandy, something she rarely indulged in, and sat down to write a letter, not to the police, not yet Buto, someone she trusted more. Her nephew Raymond. My dear Raymond, you once told Method. Writers are best at spotting lies, because they spend so much time creating them. I wonder if you might visit for a few days. There's a very interesting woman living in the vicarage, and I believe you might be the very sort of man to coax the truth, or two from Hershold. She'll be persuaded to sit down for tea. The next morning, she posted the letter in, then walked to the post office to ask a simple question. Did Miss Layton receive any parcels last week? The postmistress, Mrs. Trigg, tapped her finger. To her chin she had a small one, come in last Tuesday, brown paper. London postmark. Did she collect it herself? No, a young girl picked it up for her, the one from the bakery Mavis. Miss Marple's mind ticked forward again. Penny, or Miss Layton, wasn't just hiding. She had made herself part of the village. Without being seen, she had even found someone to run errands for her. It was clever, too clever, because someone else had found her too, and now 2 men were dead. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and looked out the window. The pieceware coming together. But one question still lingered. Had Penny Miss Layton killed to protect herself, or was someone else doing it for her? Chapter 8. Ramonderis in Marleycombe, 3 days after the murder of John Dunnigan. For after the wedding, that wasn't Raymond West, stepped off the midi train at Marleycombe. Halt. He wore a pale linen jacket, a collar unbuttoned in casual rebellion, and a notebook, half tucked under one arm. His shoes, polished but not ostentatiously so, crunched over the gravel as he made his way toward the village. He found his aunt waiting by the postbox, knitting needles poking from her handbag like antenna and chain. He greeted her with a kiss on the cheek. You look entirely to come for someone surrounded by corpses.com is the best way to stay useful, she said cheerfully, and once hold. Never panic unless the pattern is complete. I'm so glad you came your letter. Intrigued, Raymond said, you mentioned a mysterious longitude murders and the possibility of poetic irony. I cleat my calendar meeting. Miss Marple smiled, and they began walking slowly through the village. The air smelled of sweet peas and fresh earth, but despite the bloom of summer, Malcolm had fallen. Quiet curtains twitched. People spoke in half-phrases. Children played more carefully, as if sensing the wrongness in the air. Raymond noticed there's a stillness here. He murmured. Yes, she said. Stillness always comes after the second death. The first can still be called tragedy. Thickened, feels like design. She brought him up to speed. As they walked the wedding, the disappearance, the discovery of Matthew's body, the arrival and swift murder of John Dunning, and the presence of the elusive Miss Layton upstairs at the vicarage. She is Penny, Miss Marple said quietly from the photograph. From London from the beginning. Is she dangerous? She is terrified, Miss Marple said, and people who are terrified are often unpredictable, but not necessarily dangerous. I think she knows more than she has told anyone, and think she may be protecting something or someone. They stopped at the bakery Mavis behind the counter, smiled nervously at Miss Marple, and looked curiously at Raymond. This is my nephew, she said. The writer. He's visiting. Ramon smiled his most charming smile. It's a writer. Yes, and quite hopeless with bread, but I hear you've been very helpful too. Miss Layton. Mavis flushed. Oh well, not really. I just drop off parcels now and then. She's very kind, quiet, but clever, you know. Do you like her? She's nice. Keeps to herself. When she gave me A whole book of poems just because, I said. I liked the smell of new paper. Miss Marple's eyes flickered. Did you ever talk about London Mavis? Shook her head. No, she said she hated Sidious Raymond and Miss Marple exchanged a glance back at the cottage. Miss Marple poured tea, while Ramon sat beneath the window, watching the trees outside sway in the soft wind. Why now? He asked. Why kill Matthew just before the wedding? 'Cause something was going to change. Miss Marple said, once married, he would be harder to reach, or perhaps, he was going to confess something to Elalina, or someone else threatened. Torrimond leaned back in a chair, and a second murder to clean to precise. It was a silencing. She said Dunning was going to reveal something, or Samayon feared he might. Raymond opened his notebook and tapped his pen. Ida liked to meet Slayton. Miss Marple nodded. Be charming, be thoughtful, but most of all, be patient. If she is what I believe she is, she will not respond to pressure. She's been hunted already, and perhaps she fears that what else. Her husband stopped that evening. Raymond walked up to the vicarage with a bouquet of sweet peas and a dog-eared copy of the collected poems of Christina Rossetti under his arm. Reverend Allerton greeted him at the door, eyes widening slightly when Miss Marple's name was mentioned. Oh yes, Miss Layton is in. I believe she's reading. Raymond climbed the stairs and knocked gently on the upper flats door. A pause, then footsteps. It opened. She was just as Miss Marple had described, pale, fine bed or hair, now tied back in a scarf, but unmistakably the same woman from the photograph. Her eyes flicked over him quickly, warily. Yes, hello, Raymond said gently. My name is Raymond West. I'm Miss Marple's nephew. She thought you might enjoy these. He handed her the book. In the flowers for a moment, she did not move then. She opened the door wider. You'd better come in. Her flat was small. Viewed towardly, a desk littered with papers, books stacked on the windowsill, a kettle just beginning to boil. She turned to him, arms crossed. You're here about Matthew? Yes, Raymond said, but notice a policeman as someone who understands that lives often fall apart long before anyone notices. She gave a quiet, bitter laugh. It's one way top it. You were there, weren't you, when he changed his name? I helped him to seat, she said softly. I helped him disappear, and now he's dead. Ramon said nothing. After a long pause, she continued. Matthew didn't die because of what he did in London. He died because he finally stopped running, and someone couldn't bear that. Who? I don't know, she said, but I think he did. I think he knew exactly who was coming for him. Raymond leaned forward, then help us find them. Sue looked up, and for the first time, she nodded. Chapter 9, The Confession of Miss Layton, Penny Layton, for she no longer denied that name, spoke slowly, carefully, as if weighing each sentence bare. She let it leave her lips. Ramon sat across from her in a little upstairs flat, the steam from their diacups curling quietly between them. Outside, Marley moved on with its illusion of normality, the sound of a distant lawnmower, the faint bark of a dog, the peal of laughter from the baker's boy, chasing pigeons near the war memorial. But here, in this quiet room above the vicarage, the truth was beginning to take shape. I wasn't his lover. Penny began it in the way people assume, but I loved him, I think, in my own way. Raymond said nothing. He had learned that the best way to gather truth was not to reach for it, but to let it settle on its own. I met Matthew Michael 5 years ago, I said. I was working for a boutique investment firm in London. We were both trying to escape something, he from his father's shadow, I from a life that never felt like mine. He was kind, funny when he let himself be quiet, but not cowardly, and he was good at spotting raw corruption patterns. Douglas Kent, Raymond asked softly. She nodded. Matthew had been feeding evidence to the serious fraud office for months. Kent was laundering money through dummy charities, over £1 million, most of it hidden behind false pension accounts. Matthew found the accounts and they found each other, and you helped him. Testify, no one else would have Virian, else was scared I wasn't a shadow, crossed her face. But I should have. Then Raymond gently laid a hand on his notebook. You disappeared together, yes. He changed his name, grew a beard, took a job as a caretaker at an estate in Yorkshire for a while, then Devon, then here. We stayed together for the first year, and then I left. Why I was scared of running, she said. He was always listening for footsteps behind us, always watching windows. I wanted to breathe, he couldn't. Raymond sipped his tea, but y'all kept in touch, a postcard once, then silence until 6 weeks. Go, Raymond, Rossetti's eyebrows, he wrote to you. She stood and retrieved a small wooden box from the shelf. Inside was a folded letter, yellowed, slightly written in Matthew's neat hand. I'm tired, Pan. I've met someone, a good woman. Want to tell her the truth, but I don't know if I can. I thought I had escaped, but I still wake expecting fire. I don't want to die in fear. She looked at Raymond. He was going to tell Ila Lenina. That's what changed, and someone knew. She nodded. Someone was watching us, or watching him. Someone followed the trail. Raymond's brow furrowed. Did Hinham anyone a threat? A suspicion? She hesitated. There was one name he never said aloud, but I saw it once, written on a scrap of newspaper. Heat Enderland. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small torn, clipping. The headline read, Douglas Cantrili's early former financier vows quiet life abroad. Beneath the short quote attributed to Kent, some things are better left buried. Some people Turnerman's stomach turned, he thought. Kent would find him. He knew Kent would trip it. He also thought someone in Marley might already be in Kent's pocket. Ramon stared at her. What do you mean, Penny? Turned back to the window. Someone here helped Kent track him. Someone who knew Matthew was living under a new name, Simeon, who wanted him exposed. Ramon stood. His heart beat faster than it had a week. I need to tell my aunt. And he nodded. Go, but be careful. This place, it's quiet. Yes, but sometimes quiet is a choice of disguise, and whoever's behind this, they aren't done yet. Back at the cottage, Miss Marple listened to Ramon's account with narrowed eyes. When he handed her the newspaper scrap, she nodded slowly. This is what I feared. She said softly, there's someone here. It doesn't belong. Not because they're from London or elsewhere, but because they serve something rotten, something that reaches beyond this village. Ramon sat heavily. Do you think it's the colonel? No, he's proud and perhaps short-tempered, but not cruel. Not this hurt of cruel Eleanor. No, Miss Marple said, more firmly, she's many things, grieving, confused, perhaps deeply hurt, but not a killer. Raymond looked at the window. Then who, Miss Marple stood slowly and walked to her writing desk. She opened a drawer and removed the envelope. Matthew had left her. There's one clue no one has noticed yet. She said something note about who killed Matthew or Dunning, but how? She turned back to Raymond. The fire in the kill. She said it was started with kerosene, but there's only one person in this village who keeps kerosene regularly for lanterns. Raymond blinked. The groundskeeper. Miss Marple nodded. Once Edwin Stuller, the same man who found Thippity, Chapter 10, the keeper of secrets. Edwin Tor had lived in Marliam longer than most remembered, a broad-shouldered man with a sun-ripened face and a way of fabuling behind you without ever making a sound. He was the estate groundskeeper, Malcolm Hall, though in recent years the work had dwindled, as had the estate's fortunes. Inn lived alone in a small cottage just past the orchard, with ivy curling up the sides and chickens scratching in the virgin yard. To the village, he was a quiet, steady presence, unremarkable, even forgettable. But Miss Marple had never forgotten a single soul in Mallium, and what she remembered most about Edwin Tola was not his work or his silence, but how rarely he asked questions, and how often he simply watched. He found the body too conveniently. She told Raymond as they walked together toward his cottage late the next morning. And he was the only one with access to kerosene. Raymond frowned. But wouldn't that make him the most obvious suspect? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, but only if you're looking at the surface. The trouble is, most people only look at Edwin Toller and never look into him. They passed the vicarage on their way and noted that Penny's window was shut curtains, drawing no sign of her. Miss Marple didn't need to be told Penny was afraid, and that fear meant they were getting closer at the cottage. Edwin was out front repairing a broken gate latch. A half-empty can of kerosene sat by his boot. Miss Marple greeted him cheerfully. Lovely morning, Mr. Toller. You've been bussy. Always something that needs mending, miss, he muttered without looking up. His voice was thick, quiet. Raymond smiled. We wondered if we might ask you a few questions. My aunt's curious about Booth Day. You found the body. His eyes flicked up at that jest. A brief movement, but enough for Miss Marple to see at the tension. The calculation he already told the inspector. Everything I'm sure you did, miss. Marple said kindly, but we were hoping to understand the path you took that morning from the meadow too. The killer take the same way every week, round the back of the orchard, across the ridge of that. Old kill's been part of my routine for 10 years. But not the burning, she sagely. Not the fire. He paused, then said no, that was new. Miss Marple moved closer, stooping slightly, as if examining the kerosene in May. She asked, and before he could stop her, she gently picked it up, nose wrinkled. Faintly, she smelled what she expected, not just kerosene, butash, old embedded. In the metal, you used this can recently, didn't you? I use it for the lanterns, he said flatly. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, but only in winter. Surely it's June, he said. Nothing. Raymond watched him know with growing unease. Toller stood still, but there was something wound-teed in him, something ready, the quiet of a trap, not peace. Miss Marple set the can down and looked him in the eye. Why did you lie, Mr. Toller? He stiffened. About what? You didn't find Matthew's body, she said. You checked it, you made sure it was destroyed. And I believe you knew what you were looking for because someone told you exactly what to burn. He laughed, but it was force. That's nonsense. Why would I? Because you owe someone, Miss Marple said, her voice still soft. And I think that someone is Douglas. Kent. Raymond stepped closer. Taller. How long have you been taking money from him? Silence then. I never meant to hurt anyone, he said. No, Ted. First he offered me enough to keep the estate afloat. Said it was just a favor. Said it was just to keep an eye tat. All, but it wasn't just that. Miss Bud Marple saggingly. You told him when Matthew arrived. Told him he was here under a false name, and you tore his jaw. Worked, then he spat onto the dirt beside his boot. I didn't think he'd kill him, he growled. Kent said he just wanted to scare him, remind him not to talk. Miss Marple's voice was very quiet. No, but Matthew was going to talk. He was going to tell Lalanina the truth. And dance, he did. Kent's whole threat lost power, so you were told to stove him. Toller's hand went to his coat, and Raymond stepped forward, at once firm and fast. Don't, he said. Whatever you're thinking, it won't go your way. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Toller lowered his hand. His shoulders slumped. I didn't kill Dunning, he said. I swear it, that wasn't me. Raymond and Miss Marple exchanged a glance. Then who did? Tur looked up. I think it was her. Who? Toller's eyes were haunted now. The redhead, the one at the vicarage. I saw her that night in the trees near the school grove. She was following Dunning. Miss Marple's mind raced. No, it didn't fit. Penny was terrified. Penny had run, but if Toller saw her there, then either she wasn't being entirely honest, or Samayon had made sure. She looked guilty. Miss Marple turned to Raymond. One need to get to Penny now, because the killer was still watching, and Penny might be next. Chapter 10. The keeper offspreads, Edwin Toller, had lived in Marley Combe longer than most remembered. a broad-shouldered man with a sun-ripened face and a way of appearing behind Agatha. Ever making a sound, he was the estate groundskeeper for Malcolm Hallville. In recent years, the work had dwindled, as had the estate's fortunes. He lived alone in a small cottage just past the orchard, with ivy curling up the sides and chickens scratching in the overgrown yard. To Devlage, he was a quiet, steady presence, unremarkable, even forgettable. But Miss Marple had never forgotten a single soul in Marley, and what she remembered most about Wintoller was not his work or his silence, but how rarely he asked questions, and how often he simply watched had found the body. Too conveniently, she told Raymond as they walked together toward his cottage late the next morning, and he was the only one with access to kerosene. Raymond frowned, but wouldn't that make him the most obvious suspect? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, but only if you're looking at the surface. The trouble is, most people only look at Edwin Toller. They'd never look into him. They passed the vicarage on their way and noted that Penny's window washed, curtains drawn, no sign of her. Miss Marple didn't need to be told. Penny was afraid, and that fear meant they were getting closer at the cottage. Edwin was out front, repairing a broken gate latch. A half-empty can of kerosene sat by his boot. Miss Marple greeted him cheerfully. "Lovely morning, Mr. Toller. You've been busy." "Always something that needs many, miss," he muttered without looking up. His voice was thick, quiet. Raymond smiled. "We wondered if we might ask you a few questions." "Okay. My aunt's curious about the day you found the body." His eyes flicked up at that. Just a brief movement, but enough for Miss Marple to see it. The tension, the calculation. "I already told the inspector everything. I'm sure you did," Miss Marple said kindly. "But we were hoping to understand the path you took that morning from the meadow to the kill." "I take the same way every week round the back of the orchard across the ridge. That old kill's been part of my routine for 10 years. "But not the burning," she said gently. "Not the fire." He paused, then said, "No, that was new." Miss Marple moved closer, stooping slightly, as if examining the kerosene can. "May I?" she asked, and before he could stop her, she gently picked it up. Her nose wrinkled. Faintlish smelled what she expected. Not just kerosene, but ash old, embedded in the metal you used. "This can recently, didn't you? Use it for the lanterns?" He said flatly. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but only in winter. Surely it's June." He said nothing. Raymond watched him now with growing unease. Toller stood still, but there was something wound tight in him, something ready, the quiet of a trapped knot piece. Miss Marple set the can down and looked him in the eye. "Did you lie, Mr. Toller?" He stiffened. "About what? You didn't find Matthew's body," she said. "You checked it. You made sure it was destroyed. And I believe Yaub knew what you were looking for, because someone told you exactly what to burn." He lied. "But it was forced." "That's nonsense. Why would Iboksu owe someone?" Miss Marple said, her voice still soft. "And I think that someone is Douglas Kent." Raymond stepped closer. "Taller, how long have you been taking money from him?" Silence. "Then I never meant to hurt anyone." "Has not at first. He offered me enough to keep the estate afloat." Said it was just a favor. Said it was just to keep an eye. "That's all." "But it wasn't just that, Miss Bud Marple said gently. "You told him when Matthew Aravet told him he was here under a false name. Didn't you tell his jaw worked?" Then Hespat onto the dirt beside his boot. "I didn't think he'd kill him. He," Growled Cunt said, "he just wanted to scare him. Remind him not to talk." Miss Marple's voice was very quiet now. But Matthew was going to talk. He was going to tell Elena the truth, and once he did, Kent's whole threat lost power. "So you were told too." "Stop him." Toll's hand went to his coat, and Raymond stepped forward, at once firm and fast. "Don't," he said. "Whatever you're thinking, it won't go your way." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Toll lowered his hand. His shoulders slumped. "I didn't kill Dunning," he said. "I swear it. That wasn't me, Raymond." And Miss Marple exchanged a glance. Then Hudatola looked up. "I think it was her who Delisa's were haunted now. The redhead, the one at the vicarage. I saw her that night in the trees near the school grove. She was following Dunning." Miss Marple's mind raced. No, it didn't fit. Penny was terrified. Penny had run. But if Tala saw it's her there, then either she wasn't being entirely honest, or someone had made sure she looked guilty. Miss Marple turned to Raymond. "We need to get to Caney now because the killer was still watching, and Penny might be next." Chapter 12. The House on Thornhill Road. The next morning, Inspector Lennox assembled a small team and set out for Thornhill. Rode a narrow, winding lane just beyond the eastern edge of Marleyan. It was a quiet road lined with tall hedges and ancient oaks, where the houses stood, spaced apart, guarded by iron gates and gravel driveways. At the end of Thornhill Road was the estate of Charles Medway, a large imposing brick manor with ivy crawling up its walls, and windows glinting coldly in the morning light. Miss Marple and Raymond followed in Lennox's car, their faces drawn intense. Penny sat quietly in the back seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The car pulled to a stop at the gate. A tall man in a dark suit appeared, clipboard in hand. He eyed the group with practiced reserve and pressed a button to unlock the iron gate. Inside, the manor was shadowed, gay and silent. Heavy curtains blocked much of the daylight, and the faint scent of tobacco smoke hung in the air. A butler greeted them with polite curiosity. "But no warmth, my Medway is expecting you," said, leading the way down a long hall adorned with hunting trophies and faded portraits. They entered a study where Charles Medway sat behind a large mahogany desk, fingers steepled beneath his sharp chin. His gray hair was impeccably combed back, his face pale and lined with years of discipline and calculation. "Inspector Lennox," he said smoothly. "Miss Marple, Mr. West, I trust Marleycombe is treating you well." Miss Marple studied him carefully, noting the coldness in his gaze and the barely perceptible twitch at the corner of his mouth. "Mr. Medway," she began, "we have some questions regarding the recent deaths of Mr. Waring and Mr. Dunning." He smiled thinly. "A tragedy, certainly. I have nothing to do with it." Ramon stepped forward. "We have evidence that contradicts your statement." Medway's eyes narrowed. "Suches." Miss Marple held up a photograph, the torn newspaper clipping. Penny had shown them this. "Man Charles," she said quietly, "has been named by witnesses as a silent partner in the crimes committed in London. You had both motive and opportunity to harm Mr. Waring and Toslin's." Mr. Dunning Medway's smile vanished. "Replace it be a mask of cold professionalism. I suggest you tread carefully, Miss Marple. I have spent my life in law enforcement. I know how to protect myself, Inspector." Lennox nodded, and "So do we." Medway stood, moving to a side table and pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "But consider this," he said smoothly. "If I were guilty, would I have stayed in this village so close to the investigation, or would I have fled long ago?" Sethroom was silent. The only sound, the ticking of a clock on the wall. Miss Marple looked at Medway steadily. "Sometimes the greatest risk is greatest arrogance." At that moment, the butler entered with a letter on a silver tray. Medway opened it, his expression flicking. "It seems," he said quietly, "that someone is trying to unsettle me." He handed the letter to Inspector Lennox, who read aloud, "We know who you are and what you've done. The truth will come out. Watch your back." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "The game is far from over, Mr. Medway." Chapter 13. A warning and a breakthrough. The threat letter delivered to Charles Medway sent a ripple of fumes through the village and its immediate surroundings. Though he maintained a facade of calm and authority, Even he could not entirely hide the tension that now hung over Thornhill Road back in Marley Combe. Inspector Lennox convened an urgent meeting with Miss Marple, Raymond, and Penny in the small sitting room of Miss Marple's cottage. The rain had returned in steady sheets, drumming on the window pane as if heavens themselves bore witness to the unfolding drama. "Someone is fighting back," Lennox said grimly, and then, not afraid to makite personal, Penny nodded, her eyes dark. With worry, "I'm terrified," she admitted. "E thought hiding here would keep me safe. But now, I'm not so sure, miss." Marple poured tea for everyone, her hands steady despite the storm outside. "This is the moment when truth demands courage," she said gently, and whence crits began to slip. Raymond flipped through his notebook, stopping at a page filled with names and dates. "There's something I want to share," he said. "While he was reviewing documents from the London trial, I found an obscure mention of offshore accounts tied to Medway. They were hidden behind shell companions registered under the name of a man called Henry Coleman." Marple raised her brows. "That name rings a bell," she murmured. "Isn't Henry Cole supposed to be missing financier from a nearby town?" "Yes," Raymond confirmed. "He disappeared, a trace over 10 years ago. Some say he was involved in fraudulent tactics before vanishing." Lennox leaned forward. "K, you suggesting a connection between Medway and Cole?" Raymond nodded. "If Medway is involved in the financial crimes Matthew and Penny exposed, Cole might be his accomplice, or worse, a victimless miss." Marple smiled faintly. "Sometimes the past has a way of reaching forward, long after we think it's gone." Just then, there was a soft knock at the door. Miss Marple opened it to find Mrs. Finch, her face pale and eyes wide. "I have something you need to see," she said breathlessly. Holding out a crumpled envelope. Inside was a photograph, freshly developed, showing a shadowy figure lurking near the vicarage the night before the attack on Penny. "Do you recognize him?" Mrs. Finch asked. Miss Marple studied the figure, tall, broad-shouldered face, obscured by the brim of a hat. "It's Edwin Toller," she said softly. Lennox's expression darkened. "We need to bring him in now," as they prepared to leave. Penny whispered to Miss Marple, "If Edwin's involved, then Matthew's death wasn't just about London, it's about Marley, too." Miss Marple nodded. "The truth is finally surfacing, but it may be more dangerous than any of us imagined." Chapter 14. Confronting the groundskeeper. The village seemed to hold its breath as Inspector Lennox and his team made their way to Edwin Toller's cottage. Once again, the rain had stopped, leaving the air fresh but heavy, as if the earth itself awaited the reckoning. Miss Marple accompanied them, her eyes sharp beneath the brim of her hat. Raymond followed closely, notebook in hand, ready to record the next turn in the tangled story. They found Toller seated at his kitchen table, a half-empty bottle of scotch beside him, and a flask of tea steaming in front of him. His face was pale, the usual steady gaze clouded with something new, fear or resignation. "Mr. Toller," Lennox began, "where have evidence linking you to the recent murders in Marley Combe?" Toller looked up slowly. "I've told you everything I know." Miss Marple stepped forward. "Gent Lennox, sometimes the truth isn't about what we know, but what we choose to reveal." He sighed deeply, setting down his glass. "I never wanted this. It started small. Just watching, reporting back. Kent promised it was for the greater good. Top protect the village," he said. Raymond leaned in. "Protect the village? From what?" "From outsiders," Toller whispered. "From people like Matthew and Penny, people who would bring trouble." Kent wanted to keep his empire safe, and that was his eyes and ears. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. "But killing, that wasn't protection." "No," Stoller admitted. "It spiraled out of control when Dunning showed up. Things got messy. I didn't kill him, but I didn't stop it either." Lennox's voice was firm. "Who did?" Toller hesitated. "I don't know. A name, just a shadow. Someone with power here in the village." Someone no one suspects. Miss Marple exchanged a look with Raymond and Lennox, the net waist-tightening, but the biggest fish still swam free beneath the surface. Will fin this shadow, she promised. Chapter 15 Secrets. Beneath the surface, the next days passed with a tension that pressed down on Marlecombe. Like a thick fog, the villagers whispered in hushed tones, casting veiled glances as if the shadows themselves might listen to the rhythm of daily life faltered. Bakery's bread was less warm, the church pews less full, and the pub's larder more strained. Miss Marple, Raymond, and Inspector Lennox Retrietto, the quiet of the cottage, to piece together the fragments of a puzzle that seemed to grow more complicated with every revelation. Miss Marple laid out the evidence with deliberate care. Matthew's letter, Penny's confession, Edwin's reluctant admission, and the shadowy figure that still lurked at the edges of the dumb investigation. There is one thing we haven't explored fully, she said, her fingers tracing a faded map of the village. The financial ties, if met waned. Kent were involved in laundering money. Someone else must have been managing the day-to-day. Someone embedded in Marlecombe. Raymond nodded, and if that person wanted to keep their role hidden, they would have every reason to silence anyone who got too close. The inspector's eyes darkened. Webb searched records, but village finances are murky. Small businesses, cash dealings, and a lot of trust. It's the perfect cover. Miss Marple stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gray skies. Sometimes the truth is buried beneath the surface in places no one bothers to look. The question is Hoban fits most from these debts, as if summoned by her words. A sharp knock interrupted the moment a young constable entered with a folder. Inspector, you requested a follow-up on the village council accounts. There's been a large transfer of £50, zero, from the parish fund to an unknown account last month. Lennox's voice was tight. Who authorized it? The constable shrugged. It's under the name G. Taylor. Miss Marple's heart skipped. Colonel Taylor. The inspector opened the folder. Yes, but the transfers started 3 months ago, and there's no record of council meetings authorizing it. Raymond frowned. That's a lot of money to move without oversight. What could it be for, Miss? Marple's eyes narrowed. A bribe, a payoff, or a desperate attempt to cover something. Up the room grew heavy with silence, each of them understanding that the final act was near. Chapter 16 The Colonel's Truth. The heavy oak door of Colonel Taylor's home creaked open before Miss Marple could knock. The Colonel himself stood there, his face stern but eyes weary as the weight of recent events had worn him thin. Miss Marple, he said, with a nod, stepping aside to let her enter. I suppose you've come to ask questions. Only the ones I need answered, she replied softly. In the drawing room, the Colonel gestured toward a chair, then took his seat by the fire. The room smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old books, a world away from the turmoil outside. I've been honest with the inspector. The Colonel began, his voice steady, about the money transfers but everything. Miss Marple listened closely. It wasn't to cover up crime, he said quickly. It was to protect Elanina. She raised an eyebrow. Protect her from what? He sighed. From me. Colonel's confession spilled forth years of regret, mistakes made during his military career, debts accumulated in secret, and a desperate attempt to shield his daughter from scandal. The money transferred had gone to pay off old creditors and maintain a facade of respectability. And Matthew, that's where I failed her, Hay said quietly. I knew about his past, knew he was running from something, but I believed my money and my influence could keep him safe. I was wrong, Miss Marple said softly. You loved your daughter. He nodded. More than life itself. But love isn't always enough. There was a long pause. I have nothing to do with these murders, he said firmly, but someone has used my mistakes to bury you, Sal. Miss Marple reached for his hand. We will find the truth Colonel and clear. Your daughter's name. Outside, thunder rumbled softly, a prelude to the storm, both literal and metaphorical, that was gathering strength. Chapter 17. The unveiling. The morning air was crisp and clear as Miss Marple Raymond and Inspector Lennox gathered once more in the village hall, the room usually filled with. The hum of everyday meetings and cheerful chatter was now thick with anticipation and tension. The evidence collected over weeks was laid out before them: letters, photographs, financial records, and witness statements. Each piece was a thread in a tapestry that had slowly begun to reveal a pattern. Miss Marple, began her voice, come boat firm. We have seen a web of deception built on fear and greed, with lives destroyed. Along the way, she turned to Inspector Lennox. The question is, who wrought this web? Who had the means, the motive, and the opportunity? Ramon stepped forward, holding a document. The missing link was the financial transactions from Theperish Fund authorized under Colonel Taylor's name, but without his consent. Nodded, we traced the transfers to a local businessman, Marcus Rowe, a make-noun for his charm and his ruthless ambition. Miss Marple, continued, Roper has ties to Douglas Kent and Charles Medway, and was the shadow who ensured silence through intimidation. Suddenly, the door opened. A figure stepped in the village. Constable breathless. Inspector Marcus Rowe has been arrested, attempting to flee. Found weapons and evidence linking him to the murders. A collective gasp for Lady Room. Miss Marple smiled slightly. The truth, as always, finds its way to light. Justice will now follow. Chapter 18. Justice in Marley. The shoe village of Malcolm breathed a cautious sigh of relief as news spread of Marcus Rowe's arrest, the man whose web of lies, greed, and murder had cast a shadow over the peaceful community was finally brought out. Justice, in the days that followed the truth, unfolded in painstaking deal. Rowe had manipulated Douglas Kent and Charles Medway, exploiting old alliances and debts. He had orchestrated the murders to silence those who threatened to expose his schemes, including Matthew Waring and John Dunning. Miss Marple watched as Elanina began to heal, her strength reddening with the knowledge that justice had prevailed. Colonel Tallord faced the consequences of his past with a renewed sense of humility, his love for his daughter. Unshaken, one crisp morning beneath the blossoming apple trees in the orchard, a small gathering celebrated not a wedding, but a new beginning for Marley. The village was forever changed, scarred but stronger. Miss Marple stood quietly, her eyes reflecting the soft sunlight filtering through the leaves. Peace, she murmured too. Raymond is not the absence of trouble, but the triumph of truth. And with that, the shadows lifted, leaving Marley bathed in gentle light. 1 Samuel chapter 19. Reflections and farewells. With justice served in the village slowly returning to its peaceful rhythms, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the strange and sorrowful tale that had unfolded in Marliam. It was a story of secrets, buried deep, of fear and courage, and of the quiet strength found in the smallest of communities. Raymond prepared to leave his notebook full of notes and new inspiration for his writing. Penny Layton had decided to leave Marley Combe as well, seeking a fresh start, far from the shadows of the past before his departure. Raymond visited Miss Marple one last time in her cozy sitting room. You always seem to find the truth where others see only silence, he said warmly. Miss Marple smiled. Truth is patient, Raymond. It waits until the time is right. Just need to listen. As the train carried Raymond away, Miss Marple sat by the window knitting quietly, the soft light of the afternoon casting gentle patterns on the floor outside. Malcolm continued its timeless dance, a village forever changed, yet still itself. Chapter 20. The quiet aftermath. The weeks following their solution of the murders saw Melian slowly reclaim its tranquil charm. Charles bloomed anew, filling the air with their familiar fragrance, and their lit streets echoed once more with the laughter of children and the soft footsteps of neighbors exchanging pleasantries. Miss Marple resumed her usual routines, tending her garden, visiting the bakery for fresh scone, and quietly observing the gentle rhythm of village life. Yet beneath her calm exterior lay the ever-watchful, minded tend to the subtle shifts that might herald new mysteries. Eleanor, having found strength in truth and justice, began to rebuild her life. The shadows of her past, while not entirely gone, no longer held dominion over her spirit. On serene evening, Miss Marple sat on her porch, a cup of tea warming her hands. The sun dipped low, casting a golden glow across the fields. She reflected on the events that had passed, on courage, on secrets, and on the enduring power of community. With a soft sigh, she whispered to the fading light, in every shadow there is light waiting to be found.